The visits began quietly on a Tuesday evening in November, when Ronaldo arrived at Hospital Niño Jesus in Madrid without fanfare or media announcement, wearing casual clothes and a baseball cap that helped him blend in with the families who filled the pediatric oncology ward's hallways. And when he approached the nurses' station to ask about visiting terminally ill children whose families had requested his presence during what doctors had indicated would be their final weeks or days, the staff initially assumed he was there for a single photo opportunity or publicity event. But what developed over the following months was something far more profound and personal. A commitment to spending time with dying children that had nothing to do with cameras or recognition, and everything to do with his growing understanding that fame could be used to bring light into the darkest moments of human experience. The first child he visited was Sofia Mendez, a 7-year-old girl with leukemia who had been fighting cancer for 3 years and whose condition had deteriorated to the point where treatment options had been exhausted and comfort care had become the primary focus. But when Ronaldo sat beside her bed and listened to her talk about her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, about the dogs she wanted to rescue and the cats she hoped to help heal, he realized that dying children often possessed wisdom and courage that adults spent lifetimes trying to develop, and their conversations about animals and healing and what it meant to care for creatures who couldn't care for themselves taught him more about compassion and purpose than any philosophical discussion he had ever had with people who hadn't faced their own mortality at such a young age. Sofia's mother, Maria, had been living at the hospital for weeks, sleeping in a chair beside her daughter's bed and maintaining hope despite medical professionals' gentle suggestions that she should prepare for outcomes that no parent should ever have to accept. And when she saw how Sofia's face lit up during Ronaldo's visits, how her daughter seemed to forget her pain and fear while talking about her dreams with someone who listened, as if those dreams might still come true, Maria began to understand that healing could take many forms, and that sometimes the most important medicine was simply being seen and heard by someone who treated her dying daughter as a complete person, rather than a tragic case that required pity rather than respect and genuine interest. The word spread quietly through the hospital's staff and family networks, not through official announcements, but through whispered conversations between nurses who had witnessed Ronaldo sitting with children for hours without checking his phone or looking at his watch. Parents who had seen him listening to their dying children with the kind of attention that made those children feel important and valued, during weeks when everything else in their lives reminded them that their time was limited and their futures uncertain. And doctors who had observed how his presence seemed to provide comfort, not just to the children, but to families who were struggling with grief and helplessness that came from watching someone they loved suffer in ways they couldn't fix or prevent. The requests for visits began arriving through hospital chaplains and social workers who had been approached by families facing final conversations with children who had mentioned wanting to meet Cristiano Ronaldo, not because they were football fans necessarily, but because they had heard from other families that he was someone who treated dying children with dignity and kindness, rather than the awkward sympathy that often characterized interactions between healthy adults and terminally ill children who had learned to recognize when people were uncomfortable with their presence and uncertain about how to respond to someone whose remaining life could be measured in days rather than decades. Each visit was different because each child was different, but what remained consistent was Ronaldo's ability to connect with young people who were facing circumstances that would terrify most adults. Children like 8-year-old Ahmed, who was dying from brain cancer, but spent their visits together teaching Ronaldo Arabic words and sharing stories about his family's journey from Syria to Spain. Or 10-year-old Isabella, who had been battling a rare genetic disease for most of her life, but used their time together to show Ronaldo the poetry she had written about hope and courage, and what it meant to live fully, even when life would be shorter than expected. The impact of these visits extended far beyond the individual children, creating ripple effects that transformed entire families' experiences of terminal illness and grief. as parents discovered that their children's interactions with Ronaldo gave them permission to talk openly about death and dying in ways that had previously seemed too painful or frightening to address directly. And siblings learned that loving someone who was dying didn't require pretending that everything would be fine, but could include honest conversations about fear and sadness and the preciousness of time spent together, regardless of how much time remained. Isabella's father, Carlos, later described how his daughter's visits with Ronaldo had changed their family's entire approach to her illness, transforming their home from a place where everyone walked on eggshells and avoided difficult topics into a space where they could laugh and cry and plan for whatever time they had left without pretending that Isabella wasn't dying or that her death wouldn't devastate everyone who loved her, but also without allowing the shadow of death to prevent them from finding joy and meaning in daily moments that became more precious because they were numbered rather than infinite. The hospital staff began to notice changes in the entire ward's atmosphere on days when Ronaldo visited, not just because of his presence, but because of the way families seemed more relaxed and open with each other, sharing stories and offering support in ways that created a sense of community among people who were all facing similar losses but had previously felt isolated in their grief and fear. And the nursing staff reported that children seemed to experience less anxiety and pain on visit days, as if having something to look forward to provided psychological relief that translated into physical comfort during medical procedures and treatment regimens that were designed to provide comfort rather than cure. The foundation that quietly emerged from these visits was unlike any of Ronaldo's other charitable initiatives, because it focused not on building things or funding programs, but on providing presence and companionship to families during the most difficult periods of their lives. With trained volunteers who could offer the kind of sustained emotional support that busy medical professionals couldn't provide despite their best intentions. And the program's success was measured not in lives saved, but in families who felt less alone during terminal illness and grief that could destroy people who didn't have adequate support systems to help them navigate loss and continue living after losing someone whose death seemed to invalidate everything they had previously believed about fairness and meaning in life. Sofia Mendez died on a quiet Sunday morning in February, her mother holding one hand while Ronaldo held the other. And her final words were not about pain or fear, but about the animals she hoped to help in whatever came after death. And at her funeral, 3 days later, Ronaldo delivered a eulogy that focused not on his own celebrity or charitable work, but on Sofia's wisdom and courage, and the lessons she had taught him about living fully, regardless of circumstances, about finding purpose in caring for others, even when your own situation seemed hopeless, and about the dignity that came from facing death with grace and concern for the people who would continue living after you were gone. The tradition of attending funerals became part of Ronaldo's commitment to these families, his presence serving not as a celebrity endorsement of grief, but as acknowledgement that the children he had met were important individuals whose deaths mattered beyond their immediate families, whose brief lives had created meaning and impact that deserved recognition from someone whose influence could ensure that their memories would be preserved and honored rather than forgotten in the rush of daily life that moved on quickly after tragedies that devastated some families, while barely registering with others who hadn't been directly affected by loss. The memorial garden that Ronaldo established at the hospital was designed as a quiet space where families could remember children who had died, with plaques bearing not just names and dates, but favorite quotes or dreams that captured something essential about who these children had been beyond their illnesses. And the garden became a place where bereaved families could meet other families who understood their loss, creating support networks that continued long after hospital stays had ended and medical bills had been paid. But grief remained as a permanent part of their lives that required ongoing attention and community support. Years later, when hundreds of families had been touched by Ronaldo's quiet presence during their darkest hours, when the hospital's pediatric ward had been transformed into a place where death was faced with dignity rather than denial, and where families received comprehensive support during terminal illness and bereavement. The true measure of his impact was not found in newspaper articles or charity reports, but in letters from parents who credited him with helping them find meaning in loss, with teaching them that loving someone who was dying required courage rather than optimism, and with showing them that grief could coexist with gratitude for time shared rather than bitterness about time cut short. The lesson that emerged from these hospital visits was that true compassion required presence rather than solutions, that accompanying people through suffering was more valuable than trying to fix problems that couldn't be fixed, and that sometimes the most important gift someone with influence could offer was simply showing up consistently and treating dying children as complete human beings whose dreams and thoughts and feelings mattered just as much in their final weeks as they would have if those children had lived to adulthood and achieved everything they'd hoped to accomplish during lives that were measured in quality rather than quantity of time spent pursuing purposes that brought meaning to existence, regardless of its duration.